and welcome to a special edition of Inside Iraq. I'm Hud Abdel Hamid. General David Petraeus and the U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, Ryan Crocker, have said that the U.S. troop surge is working. But both men faced tough questions during their testimonies, in particular from the Democrats. President George Bush has accepted the advice from Petraeus of a limited troop withdrawal by next July. But the issue of Iraq is fueling tensions within the United States and is likely to be the key topic in the U.S. presidential campaign next year. In the first half of this program, we look at the implications of the Petraeus report within the United States. And in the second half, we focus on what the American policy might mean for Iraq and its neighbors. But first, let's take a look at the man who has become so linked to President Bush's search policy. Rawia Rageh reports.
He's always tried to be a different kind of soldier. Understanding local culture, talking to tribal leaders, that's been the policy of General David Petraeus. As commander of the 101st Airborne Division, he became involved in reconstruction and securing local elections. That approach is what enabled him to write what's considered the definitive manual on counterinsurgency. He was also put in charge of training the new Iraqi army. Washington saw him as the man who could save Iraq. He was chosen in January as the public face of President Bush's search policy.
There's the rules.
The 54-year-old New Yorker bore all the hallmarks of a PR cell. General Petraeus reached new heights of exposure in recent days, giving his assessment of the situation in Iraq before Congress.
As a bottom line up front, the military objectives of the surge are in large measure being met.
It was the most anticipated presentation by an Army officer since 1967, when General William Westmoreland testified about the Vietnam War. That conflict was the subject of Petraeus' PhD dissertation. His topic had been the lessons U.S. military could learn from the Vietnam War. Some critics say, all these years later, the general had failed to heed his own advice. In his testimony, Petraeus warned against a quick withdrawal from Iraq.
But even before the testimony, as leaks trickled out to the international media, there was uproar about what the general was about to say. An American anti-war group took out a full-page ad in the New York Times, accusing General Petraeus of cooking the books for the White House. General Petraeus or Betraeus, it asked.
This is not a knock on you, General Petraeus.
And his recommendations didn't exactly fly in Capitol Hill.
The fact remains, gentlemen, that the administration has sent you here today to convince the members of these two committees and the Congress that victory is at hand. With all due respect to you, I must say, I don't buy it.
Please don't do what you did in 2004 when you painted a rosy scenario in an op-ed piece, turned out to be wrong, like you did in 2005 when you told us, and we believed you, that the Iraqis were just about there. They were going to take over their own defense. And please consider that others could be right.
If concentrated into this dry form,
in 2003, General Colin Powell managed to win over doubters with his presentation before the United Nations in the build-up to the war in Iraq. Ultimately, that presentation destroyed Powell's credibility, a risk General Petraeus is facing as he attempts to convince Congress to stay the course.
The right man.
Rawia Rageh for Inside Iraq.
So, is General Petraeus under pressure from the politics of the Iraq war? What are the implications of his report in the run-up to the U.S. presidential elections next year? To discuss these issues, I'm joined by four guests from Washington, D.C. Mr. Edward Walker, former U.S. Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs and a former U.S. Ambassador to Israel and Egypt. Patrick Lawson, Deputy Director for Research at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Steve Clements, Senior Fellow at the New America Foundation. And retired Lieutenant General Robert Gard, who today serves as the Senior Military Fellow at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Iraq. Mr. Gard, let me start with you. Was the General Petraeus assessment an objective military assessment, or was it a politicized report?
I believe that General Petraeus is honest. When you give someone in uniform a mission, he's going to do everything he can to accomplish it. And I think it's part of the human condition that one tends to look at what seems to be working and to capitalize on it. I don't believe that he, at least, was a political instrument of the president in a direct way, although he certainly was indirectly.
Well, Patrick Lawson, didn't Petraeus give us a bit of an impression that that the surge was working and actually security was improving?
Well, the surge has been improving security, and that is the area that Petraeus was concentrating on. Now, along with him, also Ambassador Crocker testified, and Ambassador Crocker said that the political situation, on the other hand, has not improved very much. So we got quite a mixed message from the two presentations. Ambassador Crocker's message was really quite a bit more negative than that of General Petraeus. And if I had been one of President Bush's political opponents up there on the Hill, I would have been giving much more attention to Ambassador Crocker's presentation, which described a rather difficult political situation, rather than General Petraeus's testimony, which described a somewhat improving military situation.
But Mr. Walker, this surge had two folds. On one side, the security, and the other side, the Iraqi government had to meet some essential benchmarks and kickstart this political process that's going nowhere. So how can we really say that the surge is working?
Well, you can say the surge is working because it has created some stability in small portions of Iraq, particularly some Sunni areas that were a mess before. I think Petraeus is right. The situation is better. Whether it's sustainable or not is another question. But on the political side, what Ryan Crocker was pointing out was we seem to be walking away from the central government or its control of the situation and moving much more towards regional agreements among tribal units in order to provide stability, economic growth, and so on, and not depend on the central government except for a check occasionally.
As the surge started, President Bush said that there would be 18 benchmarks that the Iraqi government had to meet and that he would be extremely strict about that. Now, throughout this entire week, we heard very little about these benchmarks. Is he changing the course? What's happening?
Of course he's changing the course. Those benchmarks are gone. Maybe someday they'll be accepted, but the current strategy is to break the country down into political units and drive for political agreement within each of these units to reduce the stress and reduce the security problem. And someday maybe we'll get back to those 18 benchmarks.
So, Steve Clements, at the moment, can we say that in any way, I mean, for the outside world, that what we heard the entire week in Washington was actually something trying to salvage President Bush than really actually giving a clear assessment of what's happening in Iraq?
Well, I think General Petraeus gave President Bush a really important gift, and that gift was he seduced Democratic critics and potential Republican defectors from the president's position into a debate about tactics that really don't address the broad geostrategic question, and what really got avoided and set aside was the question you're asking, which was the big question about strategy. What are we seeking to achieve? And the president has slipped through, and I think he's done a very good job. His speech last night was very compelling, seemed sincere, the swagger was gone, and he's offered something that was structural, which was to reduce the military component by about 30,000 troops, which we were going to probably need to do next spring anyway. And in doing so, he's probably stemmed the tide of Republican defections and held the coalition supporting his views together. So I think that we've been drawn into a debate about tactics. And what was interesting about Petraeus's comments is, at best, we're talking about nuances. Clearly, General Petraeus is telling the truth about the empirical results as he sees them of levels of violence in Anbar and certain sections of Baghdad. But we're still talking about nuances. If it were clear as day success, we would not be having the debate we are.
Mr. Gard, now President Bush and Petraeus were talking about pulling out troops, but when you pull out these 30,000 surge troops, isn't there a risk that the situation, the security situation, will just deteriorate as very quickly? I mean, you take off the lid, and what happens next?
Well, I think that certainly is the case. That is a matter of concern, but the drawdown of this number of troops is inevitable unless you change your deployment policies and increase deployments from, say, 15 to 18 months, or to call back on duty National Guardsmen and reservists who have only recently returned from being deployed. Politically, that probably is not doable at this point.
Patrick Clausen, so at the end of the day, don't you get the impression that really all these security gains that they're talking about is actually artificial, and it's all because there's so many troops and so many joint command centers in the middle of Baghdad, and then really nothing has been solved on the ground?
One of the biggest security improvements has been in Anbar province, and that has come because of a decision by a significant portion of the Sunni population to work with the Americans in order to get rid of al-Qaeda in Iraq. And the surge has helped facilitate that process, but the basic change was a decision by Iraqis, the Sunni community in particular, to work with the Americans. And the Americans correspondingly made a big adjustment in their strategy and decided to work with the local Sunni community and not to insist that that community depend upon the national government in Baghdad, but instead the Americans are helping empower those Sunni communities to run their own affairs. So we've seen a considerable improvement in the security situation related to the surge, but basically because of the actions of Iraqis. That's been, in fact, a bigger change than what's happened in Baghdad, where the Americans have been concentrating their efforts.
We'll take a short break now, and when we come back, we'll continue with our analysis of the Petraeus report.
Changing the definition of success to stay the course with the wrong policy is the wrong course for our troops and our national security. Barack Obama, US Senator, presidential candidate 2008.